Welcome to the history of the Doukhobors. The story of the Doukhobors, Doukhobor, can be traced from the 17th century in Russia. However, it is believed they existed centuries earlier. The development of Doukhobor identity, beliefs, and practices occurred under the guidance of notable vazhdi, leaders. The leaders provided a foundation of beliefs and practices that defined and continue to define the Doukhobors today. They professed that the path towards God's grace was through love for one another and not through church rituals. For the Doukhobors, church protocols and dogma were seen as pointless because it did not foster, rather hindered, spiritual development. Divinity, they believed, resides in the heart of every individual. With the power of love as their guiding principle, they would not allow the killing or harm of others. The Doukhobors did not participate in the Russian Orthodox Church. They did not recognize the authority of the Church or the Tsar. Both the Church and state confronted Doukhobor non-compliance with all manner of persecution. Some of the more common methods of persecution and torture included property confiscation, public lashings, mutilation, detainment in prisons or monasteries, and exile. The dangerous yet sincere resistance to church and state protocols required extraordinary faith and courage from the Doukhobors, and it was this very faith and commitment to their beliefs, seen as resistance by church, that led to an archbishop giving them the name Doukhobor. Dukh meaning spirit, Borцы meaning wrestlers, spirit wrestlers. The name was meant to be derogatory, as those who wrestle against the spirit. But Doukhobors accepted this name and reinterpreted it to mean wrestle with the spirit for justice, truth, and freedom. Their symbols, bread, salt, and water, are long-standing symbols they used historically and to the present day. Bread, salt, and water are typically placed before Doukhobor gatherings for prayer, singing, and ceremony, and represent a welcoming space of communion for hospitality, peace, and spiritual practice. In 1801, Tsar Alexander, sympathetic to the Doukhobors, granted them land in the Milky Waters region, north of the Sea of Azov, an area with an agreeable climate and beautiful landscapes. With their agricultural expertise, they produced an abundance of food and provisions. They were able to work, prosper, and gather freely for millennia, prayer meetings, to sing and pray in unity. Sadly, this Eden was short-lived, as more struggles were on the horizon. Following the death of Tsar Alexander I, Tsar Nicholas I ascended the throne, and with him came a new attitude toward the Doukhobors. They were seen as a dangerous element, whose influence amongst the common Russian folk needed to be minimized. There also was an intention to appropriate the lands that Doukhobors occupied and developed. The Doukhobors were given an ultimatum: convert to Orthodoxy and serve in the military, or be exiled to the regions of Transcaucasia. And so began a trek of thousands of Doukhobors toward an unknown fate. Between 1841 and 1845, nearly 5,000 Doukhobors trekked to a high elevation in Transcaucasia, a journey of over 1,000 kilometers that took at least 8 months to complete.
Escorted by armed military detachments, the exiles traveled in large groups. Adults walked the entire distance, while children and the elderly rode in wagons. Nights were spent in crowded, squalid way stations. Dried food had to be eaten, the water supply was often inadequate, and disease frequently struck the migrants on the road. They had to find their way through roadless mountain passes and struggled to keep their wagons from going over precipices. Snowstorms rendered trails impassable, even in the summer. Without much to graze on, livestock perished, and with them what little food was available. By the time the exiles completed their journey, many were exhausted, ragged, and starving.
Life in the Caucasus was tough, with its harsh climate, rough terrain in which to farm, and they were often confronted by hostile neighbors. Their life was extremely challenging, yet due to their hardiness, skill, hospitality, and faith, they persevered. Over time they adapted and prospered, with their population growing to over 20,000 people. Lukeria Kalmakova, or Lushichka as she was affectionately called, was their esteemed leader. She led the Doukhobors in the Caucasus between 1864 and 1886, and did so in the spirit of equality and justice. Throughout her 22 years of leadership, the Doukhobors enjoyed a peaceful alliance with the Transcaucasian communities, the Russian authorities, and local officials. 6 weeks after her death, in 1887, thousands of Doukhobors attended a mass remembrance in her honor. It was at the remembrance that Peter Vasilievich Verygin was formally acknowledged as the next leader. However, a faction of Doukhobors were so opposed to Verygin's leadership, they had him arrested. He was jailed and banished to Siberia, where he spent nearly 15 years in exile. Doukhobor messengers devoted to him would venture to him for his counsel. They would deliver messages from him to their communities. He called for a communal lifestyle based on equality and adopt the principles to abstain from the use of alcohol, tobacco, and eating meat. He encouraged the Doukhobors to live up to their principles of nonviolence, leading to the pivotal act of the burning of arms. The burning of arms took place June 29, 1895, in 3 main Doukhobor settlements in Transcaucasia.
On the evening of June 28th, wagon loads were quickly assembled at the chosen spots and carefully and systematically piled, first with firewood, then with coal, in order to produce sufficient heat to destroy the metal weapons. The coal was drenched with kerosene and the weapons were piled on top. This was followed by the addition of even more firewood and coal. Now the size of a large multi-story building, the pile was again thoroughly doused with kerosene. The carefully prepared stack immediately burst into a gigantic blaze which, situated as it was atop a hill, could be seen for miles in every direction. Gathered around each of the bonfires, hundreds of Doukhobors prayed and sang psalms throughout the night.
Russian authorities became angered at this action by the Doukhobors and quickly dispatched Cossack soldiers to punish them.
At the sound of the bugle, the Doukhobors sensed the imminent danger and hastily assembled into a large protective circle with tightly bunched, concentric rows of younger men on the outside and women and older men on the inside. With backs turned outward, the Doukhobors passively awaited the onslaught. Goading their horses into a brisk gallop, the 200 Cossacks charged at the defenseless Doukhobors. Resilient and undeterred, the Doukhobors endured the fierce lashings.
Military authorities set into action to arrest the ringleaders and force the Doukhobors into submission. The Doukhobors suffered greatly in the aftermath, as the military became an abusive force in their villages. For all their persecutions the Doukhobors endured, they survived with steadfast faith and unshakable spirits. It is with deep reverence that the song Борьба за свободу, the struggle for freedom, is sung today for all Doukhobor ancestors who suffered for their beliefs. Meanwhile, the Doukhobor plight became known to Lev Tolstoy, a Russian author, philosopher, peace activist, and friend of Peter Vasilievich Verygin. The Tolstoyans campaigned on behalf of the Doukhobors, along with the Religious Society of Quakers and key ministers in Canada. They were all integral to the successful emigration of Doukhobors to Canada. In 1899, over 7,500 Doukhobors reached Canadian shores. For many of the Doukhobors leaving Russia and loved ones, it was heart-wrenching. Many tears were shed as the ships left the port of Batum toward the foreign land of Canada.
The shore slowly moved away from us as the ship gradually picked up speed. As the ship departed, the Doukhobors stood with their eyes full of tears facing the land where they grew up, a land where their grandparents and great-grandparents lived and died, where their leaders are buried, where they had to bear so much suffering and accept so many heavy losses. Their voices joined in the mournful sounds of a psalm, a cry of despair for leaving their motherland and wondering what lay ahead for them.
After a month-long voyage, the east coast of Canada was within sight. One can only imagine what a relief it would have been to see land and soon walk upon it and wonder what might lie ahead. Upon their arrival, crowds could be seen lining the shore, welcoming the newcomers. And what a sight they witnessed. The Doukhobor men were dressed in sheepskin coats, fur leggings, and fur caps. The women dressed in full skirts and sheepskin coats. Soon after, the Doukhobor newcomers embarked upon the long journey by train to the prairies. They settled in reserve villages in Saskatchewan, and little did they know it was upon lands that were stolen from Indigenous peoples. And yet the Indigenous people supported them during trying times. The landscapes were beautiful, with plenty of strawberries, raspberries, gooseberries, and mushrooms, and the soil was ideal for farming. However, surviving the first year was backbreaking. They built homes and broke land with experienced yet worn hands. Much of this done by the women, as the men needed to find work outside of the villages. The Quakers supplied Doukhobor communities with food, wool, garden seeds, and other resources to help them in that first year. They also received support from the Tolstoyans, including medical support. One of the nurses confessed in a letter that she wept when she witnessed malnourishment and illness in the Doukhobor villages.
Where there is community, they live in a surprisingly harmonious manner. Young women bring bags of clay up the hill. Old women bring water and mix the clay with their feet, then make bricks. Girls bring sticks from the forest. Boys cut them, and out of all this, men build places to live. But I do not know whether it will be possible for them to spend a cold winter in these temporary dwellings.
Leopold Solzhenitsyn, a Tolstoyan and supporter of the Doukhobors, commented,
When I came to a narrow strip of plowed field, I saw at the far end of it a colorful crowd of people slowly moving in my direction in a long row. These people were hitched in pairs to an iron plow. It became quite a sight when, stepping heavily on the wet grass, this somber procession began to approach me. There was something solemn, deeply moving in the figures of these straining women pulling the heavy plow. The heavy sticks to which the rope was tied cut into their bodies. With sunburnt hands, the women pushed the plow, trying to reduce the pain.
Up to 66 villages were constructed during the Doukhobors' first year in Canada. These were built in a similar fashion to their villages in Russia. The Doukhobors continued to be a strange sight for the Canadians. With their traditional clothing, mannerisms, and accents, they were thought to be peculiar. Unfortunately, the Doukhobors endured much hostility, discrimination, and bullying. Nevertheless, they prospered with efforts based on living and working communally and tied by faith. The Doukhobors, known as the Christian Community of Universal Brotherhood, a name given to them by their leader, Peter Vasilievich Verhagen, were well established on the prairies by 1902. Their accomplishments, made only in a few years in Canada, were nothing less than extraordinary. They had accumulated livestock and farming equipment. Being industrious, highly skilled, and community-minded, they built villages as well as bridges and ferries. By the end of 1903, they had constructed grain mills and sawmills and brick factories. The daily routine in the village life involves singing to welcome in the morning and mark the end of the day. They sang devotional hymns and light-hearted songs. Singing could be heard from early morning to late evening, including Sunday Malenia, to sing and pray in their traditional manner. All of this was established without their beloved leader, Peter Vasilievich Verhagen, affectionately referred to as Peter the Lordly or Haspodny. He continued to serve out his sentence in exile in a Siberian village in Russia. In the beginning, Doukhobor life on the prairies appeared to be well-functioning, as they followed a communal lifestyle in their cultural and religious way of life. They had imagined a place where they could live freely without government interference. But settling in a foreign land as new immigrants was no easy undertaking, especially while facing government stipulations that countered their beliefs. Although they were given military exemption, they were not aware they would be expected to fulfill other Canadian laws. For example, all immigrants arriving to settle on the prairies were expected to fulfill the requirement of the Homestead Act. Each man was required to make an individual land entry by signing for the land and becoming a Canadian citizen, and in turn receive 160 acres of land. In addition, this included swearing an oath of allegiance and providing vital statistics. This became a serious point of contention for the Doukhobors. This was not the state's business, they believed. Being under such pressure in a foreign land, with their beloved leader, Peter the Lordly, still in exile, the Doukhobors naturally felt at a loss. Their responses to the challenges they faced led to the formation of 3 different Doukhobor streams. The largest group of Doukhobors, the Christian community of Universal Brotherhood, or Community Doukhobors, were considered as the center and followed Verrigan's goal to establish a communal way of life and economy. The Doukhobors on the left were called the Sons of Freedom, or Free People. They held to an ideology based on extreme simplicity and devotion to Doukhobor ideals. On the right were the independent farmers. They preferred economic independence rather than a communal lifestyle. They decided to accept the Homestead Act and were called the Independent Doukhobors. Looking back to 1902, an extraordinary event occurred. A mass pilgrimage of approximately 2,000 Doukhobors set out to seek a promised land, a life based on their understanding of true Doukhobor values, as was described in the writings of Peter the Lordly and a few idealistic Tolstoyans. The Doukhobor pilgrims prepared for their journey with firm devotion to what they understood as the essence of Doukhoborism. They became known as the Sons of Freedom, or Svobodniki, meaning free people. It could be said they were moved by the same spirit of determined resolve to take a stand for peace, as was done at the burning of arms in Russia. They were returned to their villages by the RCMP. However, they continued their quest for simplicity and freedom through complex resistances, which led to their mistreatment and imprisonments. In 1902, Peter the Lordly was released from his exile after completing 3 5-year sentences. In December of that year, he arrived in Canada. He toured each Doukhobor village and was greeted with great joy. By 1907, the Canadian government saw that the Doukhobors would not comply with Canadian laws to become naturalized citizens. This resulted in the government confiscating the lands they settled upon and farmed. The lands, almost 300,000 acres, were made available to the general public, bringing about an astonishing land rush. According to an RCMP inspector,
holding the mobs back was a nightmarish task. I have never experienced a meaner job than this.
In 1908, the community Doukhobors were on the move, leaving Saskatchewan for British Columbia to begin anew, yet again. The independent Doukhobors remained in Saskatchewan to continue with their way of life based on their understanding and values. The Sons of Freedom, smaller in number after the 1902 pilgrimage, remained part of the community Doukhobors while retaining their understanding of Doukhoborism. Earlier that year, Peter the Lordly and a few delegates left for the Kootenay region in BC and acquired new lands to rebuild their communal lifestyle. What they saw was a mountainous terrain thickly forested and still under spring snows. Peter the Lordly exclaimed,
"Our people will find a refuge and a haven among these mountains."
It was there in the southern interior of BC, Doukhobors would settle to build their communities and continue to develop and uphold the Christian community of Universal Brotherhood. The foundation of the community was based on the motto by Peter the Lordly, "Toil and Peaceful Life." In the early years in BC, the Doukhobors worked tirelessly to establish their community. In a short time, the community made significant accomplishments due to a lifestyle of great simplicity and frugality. Community accomplishments included orchards and the planting of over 50,000 fruit trees by 1911. They constructed flour mills, lumber mills, brickyards, bridges. Of particular note is the Doukhobor Suspension Bridge in Brilliant near Castlegar, BC, which served the general public. They developed a cannery and jam factory in Brilliant, the Kootenay Columbia Preserving Works, and a cannery in Grand Forks. Within the communities were skilled carpenters, blacksmiths, mechanics, machinists, engineers, shoemakers, gardeners, beekeepers, weavers, bakers, tailors, veterinarians, and healers. The overall community organization quickly acquired self-sufficiency and stability for all members, including elders, those widowed, orphaned, disabled, or sick. For over 25 years, this support system was completely self-sufficient, with minimal aid from external sources. Peter the Lordly was involved in every aspect of community life, from the economic and organizational end to the cultural lifestyle and religious and spiritual development. On Sundays, the whole day would be taken up with singing and discussions. You can imagine the Doukhobors coming together in a hillside orchard to sing their rich harmonies for hours under the open sky. The members of the community would gather at dawn to pray and sing. When Peter the Lordly was present, he would engage in discussions on spirituality and politics. Unfortunately, there were new struggles to contend with. The Doukhobors faced British Columbia's stringent laws when it came to registration, tax regulations, and compulsory schooling. BC laws afforded little consideration to non-conforming minorities, such as the Doukhobors. Efforts were made by the government to enforce obedience to the laws with penalties that included fines and confiscating community possessions. At first, the community Doukhobors resisted those laws and faced the consequences from the government. Eventually, they accepted the stipulations, aside from the continued resistances from the Sons of Freedom Doukhobors. Participation in public schools in Saskatchewan began as early as 1907, with much help from the Quakers and Tolstoyans. By 1912, most children from independent Doukhobor homes in Saskatchewan were attending public schools. In BC, the question of schooling was complicated. The community Doukhobors either accepted schooling with limitations or did not accept schooling at all. Compounding this non-compliance was the introduction of militia and rifle training in public schools. Therefore, the community Doukhobors preferred to educate their children at home by their own cultural and traditional values and practices. Although BC's government remained firm on their position of compulsory school attendance, there were compromises, such as rifle training not being mandatory for Doukhobor children. Community Doukhobor children eventually attended school from partial to full attendance. During the winter of 1923 to 1924, Peter the Lordly called almost daily meetings in Brilliant to discuss spirituality and morality.
Human life, I think, is like a real art. It consists not in quantity and size of things made, but in their quality, beauty, perfection, harmony. Such is our life. We must strive to live it better, not to care how long it would be, as we all know, does not depend on our own will.
He encouraged independent thinking and the development of one's own conscience to make appropriate decisions. One night, a small group of people gathered at the train station for the departure of Peter the Lordly and his companion Maria Strelaev from Castlegar to Grand Forks. When the train whistle blew, Peter the Lordly looked out at all those gathered and spoke his last words to them.
Well, brothers, farewell and forgive me. We are going on a faraway journey.
It was 1 a.m. in the morning when the train left the station at Farron. The train did not even travel 1 mile when there was an explosion. A bomb under Peter the Lordly's seat exploded. He was thrown 30 feet down a hill. Maria Strelaev was thrown even further. In the early hours of the 29th of October, the sad news of the death of Peter the Lordly was heard throughout all Doukhobor communities. The terrifying news struck the Doukhobors like a thunderclap. People were numb with disbelief, weeping in sorrow. On the 2nd of November, 1924, a crowd of up to 10,000 people gathered for Peter the Lordly's funeral. They proceeded to the gravesite with a banner that read, "Toil and Peaceful Life, Peter the Lordly." When they arrived at the gravesite, the mournful sounds of psalms and weeping resounded as the coffin was lowered into the grave of carved rock situated above Brilliant. And here the crowd sang his favorite hymn, "Nearer, my God, to Thee." The singing continued for a very long time as the people did not want to leave his grave. The sun set behind the mountains, and the shadows descended on earth. Dusk was approaching. All the people knelt once again before departing.